there are also these fateful, life-changing moments in gaming. The history of PlayStation is full of these moments. And as the PlayStation 1 celebrates its 30th anniversary this year, I have decided to take a comprehensive look at the emergence of the console, its triumphant journey, and the legacy it has left behind. Of course, I will also talk about the break with Nintendo, the hardware itself, and all the key games. And believe me, there were many of them. So take some time, grab a snack, and travel with me back to the years that were completely dominated by the PlayStation 1. When the PlayStation was launched in December 1994 in Japan, the gaming industry was suddenly transformed. But what am I saying? Before we look at the launch of the console, we need to talk about its development. And this began in 1991. However, that is not entirely correct, as the spark that led to the wildfire, that reduced Nintendo's dominance to ashes, was ignited 3 years earlier, namely in 1988. However, I would like to travel even further back in time, to the year 1946 to be precise. I think it makes sense for us to first take a look at Sony and clarify where the company came from and what its foundation was, as this will be quite important later on. Shortly after the end of the war, Masaru Ibuka, along with Akio Morita, founded a small company called Tokyo Tsushin Kyogo. It was one of those bright spots in Japan during the early post-war period. A small electronics company with a big vision to supply the country with high-quality products. And 9 years later, it finally happened. In 1955, TKK released the first transistor radio, which became a great success in Japan and brought money into the company's coffers. More successful products followed, and just 2 years later, Ibuka and Morita made the decision to expand and distribute their products worldwide. To achieve this, a new name was needed, something that wouldn't be a tongue twister for the rest of the world. Thus, Tokyo Tsushin Kyogo became Sony in 1957, and global distribution proved to be another success factor. In 1959, the first of these fateful moments I mentioned in the intro was to occur, which would contribute to the success of PlayStation, even though it was not yet on the agenda. In that year, Sony hired the young Norio Oga. The then 29-year-old had a great passion for music and criticized the quality of Sony's cassette recorders at that time. His technical and musical knowledge caught the attention of Ibuka and Morita, leading them to hire him as a technical advisor who would climb the career ladder faster in the following years than anyone else in the company. We will discuss why Oga's appearance is important later, but remember his name. In the 1960s, Sony grew into a global market leader and earned a significant amount of money through the production of radios, televisions, and other electronic products. The specialization in multimedia products was the driving factor for success, which attracted more and more talent to Sony. In the mid-1970s, a young technician named Ken Kutaragi applied to Sony and was allowed to start his work at the company in 1975. He worked on early LCD panels and digital cameras, among other things, but that is not the work for which he would become known. Before the 70s ended, Sony released a product with the Walkman that would revolutionize the industry in a way that rarely happened. Suddenly, it became possible to take your favorite songs anywhere, a revolution that made Sony even more popular, especially among young audiences. In the same year, Sony entered into a collaboration with Philips to take the medium on which music had previously been recorded to the next level. Work on a storage medium that would soon be known as the compact disc began. And when Sony released the first CD player in 1982, the world gained a groundbreaking invention, and Norio Oga was already at the helm of the Sony corporations. Just a year later, Nintendo and Sega released their home consoles in the Japanese market, and especially Nintendo celebrated tremendous success with the Famicom, which briefly caught Sony's attention. In the eyes of the Sony executives, game consoles were considered children's toys and not something to be taken seriously. But this supposed children's toy was also released during the rise of two consoles in 1988, the PC Engine and the Sega Mega Drive, which excited many Japanese and took video games to the next level. At the same time, Ken Kutaragi also recognized the potential of the medium as he watched his daughter play with Nintendo's Famicom at home. And when Nintendo was looking for a partner to create the sound chip for the Famicom successor in 1989, Kutaragi seized the opportunity and got to work. The SPC 701 sound chip emerged, which ensured that Nintendo's next-gen console was miles ahead of the competition from Sega in terms of audio quality. However, the development of the sound chip was not without risks for Kutaragi. Since those responsible at Sony did not want to know anything about the video game industry, Kutaragi secretly developed the sound chip for Nintendo. When his work with the officials leaked, they were beside themselves and even demanded his dismissal. Only Norio Oga, who was already the CEO of Sony in 1989, kept a clear head and was even able to understand the potential that Kutaragi saw in the development of such a chip. Norio Oga made a decisive statement, silenced the Sony executives, and gave Kutaragi the green light to finish developing the sound chip. At the same time, Sony launched its subsidiary Sony ImageSoft in the USA, which was tasked with distributing games on the NES and later also on the SNES. It was an early attempt to gain initial experience in business, which would pay off significantly with Olaf Olofsson at the helm, but more on that later. Without Oga's intuition and foresight, which he demonstrated at that moment, there may never have been another collaboration with Nintendo, and Sony would never have entered the gaming business. I deliberately say maybe, as there are reports suggesting that Kutaragi himself threatened to resign if he were prohibited from working with Nintendo. And who knows if Sony would have wanted that, as he was one of the best engineers in the company at the time. It's hard to imagine what would have happened if Norio Oga had sided with his board colleagues and left Sony. But well, back to the topic. When the chip was fully developed and the Super Famicom was praised by critics for its brilliant sound output, Kutaragi took a step further and proposed a new collaboration to Nintendo. He believed that a disc add-on for the Super Famicom would increase Nintendo's competitiveness. And when Norio Oga was also on board for this endeavor, they began working on the disc add-on. The agreement that Sony had made with Nintendo at the time not only included the add-on that was attached to the Super Famicom, but also the creation of a hybrid console specifically manufactured by Sony, which connected the cartridge slot of the Super Famicom with the disk drive, allowing buyers to use both types of media from the outset. At the same time, Sony was working on a dedicated disc format that was to be used with the hybrid console as well as the add-on called Super Disc. This new hybrid system was developed at Sony under the codename PlayStation and was set to be presented to the public at the CES in Los Angeles in 1991. The basis for the collaboration between Nintendo and Sony was a contractual agreement regarding the licensing and usage rights of the Super Disc format, which increasingly caused discontent at Nintendo and would be the reason that everything preceding it would collapse like a house of cards. The contract guaranteed Sony 100% of all revenue that would have been generated from the sale and licensing of Super Disc content. Nintendo's share would continue to relate to the licensing and sale of game cartridges, which Hiroshi Yamauchi considered insufficient. In his eyes, Sony was given too much power, as they had no knowledge of the video game business being an electronics company. He saw a danger for Nintendo, as Sony insisted on equipping both the add-on and the PlayStation with the capability to play video and music content through the Super Disc format. That would be another source of revenue that one would have to fully attribute to Sony but did not want to. This kind of enrichment, at least in the eyes of Hiroshi Yamauchi, and the resulting distribution of rights were a thorn in the side of the Nintendo CEO. Even with the sound chip of the Super Famicom, Sony had already made a negative impression on him, as third-party studios had to exclusively purchase the development tool for the sound chip from Sony at a high cost. In Yamauchi's eyes, there were simply too many concessions made to Sony by Nintendo in exchange for an add-on of which they didn't even know if it would be successful. And instead of reopening the negotiations, Hiroshi Yamauchi decided to annul the contract with Sony. And as if that weren't already absolutely unfair and lacking in partnership, he made the decision just before the CES without informing Sony. Instead, he sent his son-in-law Minoru Arakawa, who was then the CEO of Nintendo of America, along with his vice president Howard Lincoln to the Netherlands to negotiate a better deal and to bring the add-on for the Super Famicom to market. As mentioned, Sony was completely unaware of this. When the summer CES began on June 1, 1991, fans and the press speculated about the promising collaboration between Nintendo and Sony, while Ken Kutaragi prepared for the press conference that Sony held on June 2, 1991. There, they presented the add-on as well as the PlayStation console and the Super Disc format to the public, which received a lot of positive feedback. The next day, Howard Lincoln took the stage and announced during the Nintendo press conference that the collaboration with Sony would be limited and that they were instead working with Philips on a CD add-on. During Lincoln's speech, several Sony representatives were in the audience, so you can certainly imagine how shocked they must have been. It was a public humiliation on the part of Nintendo. Just a day earlier, Sony had proudly presented the PlayStation and the add-on, and now they were dismissed in a mere aside. A scandal. What did not reach the public after the CES were the many discussions between Nintendo and Sony to salvage the deal. Sony's officials attempted to renegotiate for weeks and months while Nintendo rejected all offers. But why did Sony go to the trouble, you may ask? Well, since Sony was firmly convinced that the collaboration was in place, they had already been diligently producing consoles. During the discussions, several hundred prototypes were created, which were subsequently destroyed by Sony. A few of them would resurface several decades later and be auctioned for a lot of money, as you may have heard. But in any case, by the end of '91, Sony tried to salvage the deal without success. In the early months of 1992, Sony made another attempt, this time targeting Nintendo's competition. In the USA, there were discussions between Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske and Olaf Olafsson, who was the president of Sony ImageSoft. After the setback with Nintendo, the two made a publishing deal to release various games on Sega's systems. In this context, Olafsson made the offer to launch a new home console together with Sega. Kalinske found the idea great and arranged a meeting with Sega of Japan. However, things did not go as Sony had envisioned. Similar to Nintendo, Sega also rejected Sony's engineers, arguing that Sony had no understanding of the industry and that their technology would not succeed. Sony was simply too inexperienced, and they did not want to take any economic risks. When the talks with Sega ended, the month of May had already arrived. The PlayStation project had been on hold for almost a whole year. In June, Norio Oga convened a meeting to decide on the future of the project. It is not surprising that Sony's decision-makers turned their backs on the gaming industry and returned to their core business after the public humiliation by Nintendo and the rejection by Sega. Ken Kutaragi, however, had a different opinion. He presented an advanced prototype that had once again been developed in secret and, once more, drew the ire of the officials. However, he managed to turn the anger of his superiors to his advantage. He brought up the humiliation caused by Nintendo and was confident that he would put Nintendo in its place with his console. Once again, Norio Oga sided with his team and ultimately gave the PlayStation project the green light, much to the dismay of many decision-makers. As a result, he transferred Kutaragi and his team. In 1992, Kutaragi and 9 developers moved to Sony Music Entertainment Japan, a subsidiary of Sony that had been led by Norio Oga a few years earlier. With this, the Sony CEO wanted to smooth things over a bit and not unnecessarily jeopardize the project. In retrospect, this was the best decision Oga could make, as Sony Music Entertainment Japan had a lot of experience in the development and playback of CDs, which would be invaluable to Kutaragi and his team and would significantly influence the development of the PlayStation. To definitively distance itself from Nintendo, Sony established a new codename for the console. However, since the PlayStation remained highly regarded by all parties involved, only a small adjustment was made and the project continued as PlayStation X. With 1993, a year that would be extremely important for the success of the PlayStation, began for Sony. However, initially they were faced with new challenges. Although the development of the hardware was still promising behind the scenes, Sony was still purely an electronics company and not a game developer. Even the US-based Sony ImageSoft was purely a publisher with little knowledge of game development. There was a lack of internal development teams that could work on the conception of new game content in parallel with the hardware development. Sony was very keen not to make the same mistake as Trip Hawkins's 3DO company, which struggled to present meaningful games just a few months before the release of their console. In the first half of the year, Sony Music Entertainment Japan dispatched several teams that swarmingly visited hundreds of Japanese game developers, attempting to bring them on board with considerable success. Sony was able to win over more than 250 studios that were dissatisfied with the licensing and publishing policies of Nintendo and Sega, including well-known names like Konami, Squaresoft, and Namco. Above all, Namco developed into a strong supporter of the PlayStation in the following months, which was related to Namco's economic situation. In the arcade sector, they had been competing with Sega for years, and with the PlayStation, Namco felt capable of taking on Sega in the console sector without having to provide its own hardware. This went so far that Namco's head of the research department met several times with Ken Kutaragi throughout the year to discuss the hardware specifications of the PlayStation. At this point, no final decision had been made on whether Sony should commit to true three-dimensional polygon graphics with the PlayStation or whether they should create a system based on 2D sprites, similar to the successful Super Nintendo, which dominated the global charts. As a small test project, the collaboration resulted in the Namco System 11, an arcade port that was based on the preliminary PlayStation hardware and was intended to be used in Namco's arcade halls by the end of 1993. At the same time, Sony acquired the Western development studio Psygnosis in May 1993, not only to have third-party software ready but also to be able to present its own games, with the acquisition of the British studio primarily aimed at preparing for the Western launch of the console. However, Psygnosis founder Ian Hetherington was not very impressed with the PlayStation hardware when he got his hands on it. He is said to have told Sony that the hardware, quote, was not really operational, let alone competitive. As a result, Hetherington and his team began to assist Sony with hardware development while simultaneously working on the first games. In August of that year, the decision was made regarding the direction Sony would take with the PlayStation. They received help from none other than Sega when they presented Virtua Fighter to the public at the Amusement Machine Show in Japan. Sony's developers were so excited about the graphics that there was no turning back for them. One of the leading PlayStation engineers said shortly after the presentation that, quote, Virtua Fighter could not have been showcased at a better time. From the year 2000 onwards, it was clear that the PlayStation would be a 3D-driven system, and Sony, along with Psygnosis, did everything possible to turn this vision into reality. 2 months later, on October 27, 1993, Sony announced at a press conference that they would be releasing their own video game console, although Sony did not provide a more specific release timeframe or details on the specs, even though they were likely nearly finalized. The announcement could not have been timed better, as just 3 days later, Ridge Racer from Namco appeared in Japanese arcade halls and quickly became an absolute sensation. The fluid graphics blew away everyone who tried the racing game, and when Namco announced in December that they would bring Ridge Racer to living rooms at the launch of the PlayStation, the hype was perfect. At the end of the year, Sony was making further preparations for the launch of the PlayStation in the coming year. Thus, Sony and Sony Music Entertainment Japan founded the subsidiary Sony Computer Entertainment. The new company was to unite all of Sony's departments that dealt with video games. At the same time, the first PlayStation development kits were created to be delivered to developer studios. These were based on Sony's own MIBA stations, making them expensive and quite complicated to handle, which was particularly a thorn in the side of Ian Hetherington and his team at Psygnosis. He believed that the success of a system also depended on how easy it was to develop software for it. Psygnosis once again got involved in development and asked the British company SN Systems to produce PC-based development kits. SN Systems, which already had experience in the field, got to work immediately and had the first PC-based PlayStation dev kits completed by the end of December. These were cheaper and significantly more flexible for game developers, which Sony soon realized for itself. When the Winter CES opened its doors in January 94, Psygnosis packed up SN Systems and their dev kits and presented them to some Sony engineers behind closed doors. They were excited, dropped their own MIPS-based dev kits, and immediately ordered 600 units from SN Systems so that they could be delivered to developers as quickly as possible. As a result, Sony gained much more interest from Western developers at the CES, who jumped on the PlayStation bandwagon and pledged their support. A long-term partnership developed between SN Systems and Sony, which also produced the development kits for the PlayStation 2 before Sony acquired the British company in 2005. But that's just a side note. After the CES, preparations for the PlayStation launch were in full swing at Sony. It became quiet until the magazine Computer Gaming World published an article at the end of March that picked up on a rumor. It was stated there that the PSX would be released at the end of the year and was expected to cost $400. In response to this rumor, which circulated worldwide in the following weeks, Sony held a meeting on May 10th. In 1994, a press conference was held that dealt in detail with the PlayStation and its release. Thus, the final design and the name of the console were announced. The PlayStation featured a distinctive angular design and definitely spoke the language of other Sony electronic devices. It did not look like a children's toy. Rather, it resembled a multimedia system that one would place in their living room. The new system was called PlayStation, or PS for short. The X from the codename was dropped, but it stubbornly persisted among fans and the press, which is why the PlayStation was often referred to as the PSX. It was also noted that the console was marketed without the Sony name addition. It was officially stated that the PlayStation could be established more quickly and successfully as an independent brand. However, the absence of the Sony logo was more due to the still cautious attitude towards the video game business. There were still enough officials at Sony who did not want to know anything about the industry, and if the PlayStation were to flop, they at least did not want the brand to be associated with it. But the signs were favorable, and the technology used caught the attention of the press. The CPU was equipped with a 32-bit MIPS R3000 chip, which had a clock frequency of 33.87 MHz. A dedicated PlayStation GPU ensured that games could be displayed in different resolutions, such as 320x240p to 640xp for NTSC devices, and 512xp for PAL devices. Additionally, the GPU included texture mapping and flat or Guro shading features for rendering complex graphics, as well as detailed sprites, which excited not only the press but also the competition. A sound chip with 24 audio channels and 512K-bit sound RAM was intended to surpass the already excellent Super Nintendo sound chip. Additionally, the PlayStation was capable of displaying full-motion videos at a higher resolution than competing systems such as the Sega CD, TurboGrafx CD, or the 3DO. The absolute highlight was, of course, the CD drive. With this, Sony made a statement right from the start that video games of the new generation would come from modular technology and offer significantly more space for content. A PlayStation disc offered up to 660 MB of storage space, featuring a black underside. Although Sony communicated that the black color served as a special copy protection, it was actually more cosmetic in nature, aimed at distinguishing PlayStation games from other CD media. However, the system did have copy protection in place. Additionally, the PS was region-locked, which meant that, for example, a Japanese model could only play games from the same region, much to the dismay of many fans. This distinction would later also provide the impetus for the first mod chips to flood the market, but more on that later. Since the console no longer supported modular technology, special memory cards had to be used to save game progress, which could be inserted into the console. There were 2 slots available located above the 2 controller ports. On the back, there were several connections. The console featured not only composite and S-video but also RGB connections, which were intended to provide better display quality. An AV multi-output and a RCA output were located on the back. There was also a serial and a parallel port that could be used for various devices. However, both interfaces were removed in future console revisions. In addition to the console, the PlayStation controller was also introduced. It resembled the SNES controller in some ways, but featured several crucial changes. For instance, the controller grips extended downward on both sides, ensuring a better grip while playing. Additionally, Sony significantly revised the appearance of the D-pad, which naturally distinguished it from Nintendo's design. The same applied to the buttons. Instead of using letters, Sony opted for symbols in naming the buttons, each of which was intended to serve a specific function. Teiju Goto, a designer at Sony who had designed the controller, explained the significance of the buttons. Thus, the circle and the X represented yes and no. By pressing the circle button, inputs were confirmed, while the X button was used to deny or cancel actions, although this would be swapped for the Western market, as would the size of the controller, which would be increased by about 10% for the launch in the USA and Europe. The triangle symbolized a direction, an orientation if you will, and the square represented a sheet of paper that was meant to call up menus. Above the controller were not 2, but 4 shoulder buttons, 2 on each side, which were intended to give players more options. This ensured that longtime gamers did not have to adjust too much, while still making the PlayStation controller feel more advanced and robust. The release was aimed for December 3rd, although only in Japan. In the West, the PlayStation was set to launch a year later, even though Sony withheld specific dates. Nevertheless, the press conference had its intended impact. People were excited and looked forward to the release. Sony promised to shake up the industry with the PlayStation. The console seemed well thought out, and the technology looked better on paper than the 3DO, which had been available since late '93, or the Saturn, which was also set to be released in Japan in 1994. Nevertheless, Sony was a newcomer in the fiercely competitive market of console manufacturers and had to prove itself first. Arcade fans got a small taste of what the PlayStation was capable of in September 1994 when Namco released Tekken. The game was developed for the Namco System 11, which, as I explained earlier, was based on preliminary PS hardware. In response to Sega's Virtua Fighter, Namco impressively demonstrated that they had produced a real blockbuster that was also set to be ported to PlayStation soon, but first, the console had to be released. On December 3rd, it finally happened. The PlayStation was available for yen on Japanese retailer shelves, and it would be an understatement to say that the environment for Sony during the PS launch was difficult. For behold, the Sega Saturn had only been released a week earlier and quickly became a major sales success. The Japanese loved Sega, they loved Virtua Fighter, and they practically snatched Saturn consoles out of the hands of retailers. Nevertheless, December 3, 1994 was also a successful day for Sony. The electronics company, with which no one in the video game industry wanted to collaborate, managed to sell consoles on the very first day. That was a damn good start for an outsider, even though Sega publicly boasted about having sold Saturn consoles. By the end of '94, which was essentially in the next 28 days after the launch, the Sony PlayStation achieved impressive sales figures, while Sega reported selling about 500,000 Saturns, marking a strong start for the unwanted outsider. This was primarily made possible by the console itself, which fulfilled all the promises made by Sony in advance, as well as a specific launch game from Namco, which was available alongside 7 other games on the release day in retail stores. Of course, we are talking about Ridge Racer. Namco kept its promise and brought the racing game sensation from the arcades to the starting line for the launch of the PlayStation, although the PS version was technically Ridge Racer 2, which had previously been released in arcades in June of that year. The work on the port paid off. Ridge Racer recorded an almost 1000% attachment rate in Japan. Pretty much everyone who bought a PS on December 3rd also took home Namco's racing game, and rightly so. Although the game did not quite match the arcade original in terms of visuals, the racer still impressed with smooth graphics, an energetic soundtrack, and flawless gameplay. Only the limited scope caused some discontent among fans. However, racing game enthusiasts celebrated Ridge Racer and had an absolute killer app for their brand new console right from the start. The remaining 7 launch games were not quite of the same caliber. At least there were exclusive titles such as the train simulation A Evolution, the anime first-person dungeon crawler Crime Crackers, and the adaptation of the Chinese board game Mahjong Station, which were only available on Sony's new machine. In addition to these, there were also the board game adaptation Mahjong Goku Tenjuku, the beat-em-up Neketsu Oyaku, the shoot-em-up classic Parodius, and the action puzzle mix Tamer Adventurous Ball. The Labyrinth is available for first-time buyers, even though these 4 games were also available for purchase on the Sega Saturn. The launch games were not exceptionally strong, as you can surely tell for yourselves. Ridge Racer is definitely the exception here, even though I do not want to deny the quality of Neketsu, Oyako Parodios, or Crime Crackers. What Sony lacked, however, was a major first-party game that could serve as a flagship. Namco's Arcade Racer fulfilled this role with flying colors. By the end of the year, more games joined the lineup, with Mortal Toon Grand Prix and Kingsfield being the most interesting. The former was a first-party title from Sony, developed by a small team at Sony Japan Studio, who called themselves Police Entertainment and would soon begin work on a racing game that would go down in video game history. And Kingsfield, that was the first video game from a small developer named From Software. Although founded in 1989, From Software had only developed computer software until now. With Kingsfield, the developers ventured into a completely new environment, which was a decision that is likely to go down in the annals of video games. In its first 28 days after release, the PlayStation already had a must-have game, a fun first-party title, and the first role-playing game, albeit somewhat unconventional. Looking at the units sold, the PS launch was a complete success for Sony. And the electronics giant only knew one direction: upwards. The new year began as successfully as the previous year had ended. The software supply rolled in, and the new releases were numerous. Thus, Japanese PlayStation owners got to see the first PlayStation fighting game in January when Battle Arena Toshinden was released. It was the second true fighting game developed for a home console after Virtua Fighter. Sony referred to it as a Saturn killer ahead of its release, which of course targeted Sega's Virtua Fighter. Ironically, just a year later, an expanded port was released on Sega's 32-bit console, but that's another story. Although Battle Arena Toshinden did not reach the level of Virtua Fighter, it was the first 3D fighting game to implement the sidestep feature, thus initiating a feature that would appear in many other 3D fighting games. In January, Sony also released the PS-exclusive Kilik. Developed by Genki, it was the first first-person shooter on Sony's console and one of the first, if not the first, first-person shooters in complete 3D. As an elite soldier, you controlled a mech and were navigating an underground base in Antarctica. And yes, the graphics do seem quite rudimentary, and to this day there are inconsistencies about whether Killik is an FPS or a high-action dungeon crawler, but in fact it was marketed by Sony as a first-person shooter and gathered a small but dedicated fan base. In March, the next killer app struck, again from Namco. Tekken made its way from the arcade halls into living rooms and was once again a punch from Namco in Sega's direction. Unlike Ridge Racer, Tekken was crafted by former Sega veterans who created a fabulous fighting game that has now received a technically flawless port. A month later, the PS received its first 3D jump and run, which also prioritized a first-person perspective, similar to what was already seen in Crime Crackers and Killik. It was ultimately the beginning of the 3D era. No one wanted to produce sprite-based games anymore. Everything had to be programmed in glorious 3D. Before that, the jump-and-run genre was also not spared, and since there was no blueprint at the time for how jump-and-runs should look, the developers of Extract and Ultra experimented with the first-person perspective. In early 1994, when the demo began, Jumping Flash was released, which was once again distributed by Sony and essentially represented the first 3D jump-and-run, although it played quite differently from anything we know in the genre today. In the skin of the Robo-Rabbit Rabbids, players jumped through various areas in search of scattered capsule jets and took various enemies under fire with projectiles, which was not so easy as orientation often suffered. But this did not significantly hinder the fun of the game. In May, there were unusually no new releases, but the first E3 event in video game history took place in Los Angeles. Of course, Sony was also present and delivered one of the most well-known moments. But before we talk about that, I would like to give you a bit of context. So, a day before Sony, Sega held a press conference. There, Tom Kalinske announced to a surprised audience that Sega would move up the launch of the Sega Saturn by 5 months and release the console on the same day at selected retailers for a price of $399. With this, Sega aimed to gain an advantage, as they had done before with the Super Nintendo, and to bring the console to gamers ahead of the PlayStation. The surprising release and the limited quantity of our consoles, however, outraged many retailers, who subsequently refused to include the Saturn in their inventory. But well, Sega not only shot itself in the foot with this, but also set the price of the Saturn at $399 in the upper segment. Media representatives and fans were eager to find out how Sony would respond. And when Sony's press conference followed just one day after Sega's appearance, the sensation was complete when Steve Reese, a former Sega employee and at that time the president of Sony Computer Entertainment America, was called to the stage to talk about the price of the soon-to-be-released PlayStation. What followed was one of the most famous moments, but see for yourself.
Entertainment President of America, Steve Reese, join me for a brief presentation. $299.
This sentence, let's call it that, not only made history but also stifled the competition between Sega and Sony in the United States before it could even begin. The qualities of the PlayStation, as well as games like Ridge Racer and Tekken, were already known in the West, and games like Wipeout, which were in the spotlight, were highly anticipated. With a price of $299, which was $100 cheaper than the Saturn, not much could go wrong in September. Before Sony was to bring their console to the West, 3 notable games were released in Japan. In June, the first strategy role-playing game saw the light of day. Arc the Lad was once again released by Sony as a first-party title and hit like a bomb in the land of the rising sun, which had long been craving a Japanese RPG. Unfortunately, the game remained exclusive to Japan for the time being, but it became the best-selling PS game of 1995 there, with over 1 million copies sold. Before the end of June, Namco released Air Combat on June 30th, a shoot-'em-up that focused on action-packed aerial battles and an engaging gameplay principle. Air Combat was far from a flight simulation, but it thrilled players even more with its action-packed missions and quickly became another hit for Namco, who wanted to release the game in the West as soon as possible. In June, there was a new supply of RPGs, but this time with a different focus. After the success of the first part, From Software released Kingsfield 2, the sequel to the Japanese market, which refined the gameplay mechanics but otherwise brought familiar RPG elements. When September finally arrived, it felt like the whole West was on pins and needles. Video game enthusiasts could hardly wait for the release of the PlayStation, and Sony had set out to serve both the USA and European markets in the same month. Oh, and before we dive into the launch games, I would like to make a brief note. I have made a great effort to identify the launch games in the USA as well as in Europe. However, it was not as easy as expected, as some release dates could not be traced back precisely. Different sources provided me with varying data for the same game. A prime example is Air Combat, which according to various sources was available as a launch title in Europe, while just as many other sources mention a release in October. So please forgive me if I sometimes don't include a game as a launch title, or the other way around. But alright, back to the topic. It all started on September 9th, 1995 in the USA, where the PlayStation was available for $299 and launched with 12 games, of which only 2 games from the Japan launch made their way across the ocean and were localized, Kalik and Ridge Racer. In addition, PlayStation early buyers could choose from 10 additional games. Battle Arena Toshinden was a solid fighting game available, which had already been released in Japan on January 1st. Anyone looking for extreme sports turned to the arcade-style ESPN Extreme Games, which featured many sports and modes and showcased an interesting graphic style reminiscent of the classic Road Rash. NBA Jam Tournament Edition was also quite sporty. The PlayStation version was significantly ahead of the bit variants and provided plenty of gaming fun. With Power Surf D-Tennis, there was another sports game available, distributed by Ocean, which couldn't quite convince due to its spongy controls. In contrast, the situation was different with Rayman. The colorful yet extremely challenging D-Jump run from Ubisoft was originally intended as an exclusive title for the Atari Jaguar. However, after the console began to struggle, Ubisoft decided to make Rayman a multi-platform game, which was one of the better titles at the PlayStation launch and impressively demonstrated that the PlayStation could showcase beautiful sprites on the screen alongside 3D graphics. Not quite as appealing was Capcom's Street Fighter the movie. The fighting game was an adaptation of the film of the same name and featured digitized fighters, similar to those found in games like Mortal Kombat. Unfortunately, the game suffered from somewhat unrefined controls, which dampened the enjoyment. The Raiden project featured 2 arcade classics that came in a compilation for the PlayStation, offering straightforward shoot-'em-up action, although it appeared graphically somewhat outdated, especially in direct comparison with other launch games. Just like Air Combat, which was released by Namco only 3 months earlier in Japan and received a good port for the US launch of the PlayStation, and with Total Eclipse, the third shoot-'em-up joined the ranks, which was originally developed by Crystal Dynamics for the 3DO. Since the 3DO also struggled like the Jaguar, Crystal Dynamics decided to bring the game to the PlayStation, as the PlayStation version offered a better frame rate and thus a better gaming experience. And the last launch game in the bunch was Zero Divide, although the sources differ on this. In many lists, Zero Divide appears as a launch title, while others report that it was released later in the month. However, I will include it, as both GameFAQs and Wikipedia list the game as a launch title for the PlayStation. After Battle Arena, Toshinden, and Street Fighter the movie, Zero Divide was the third fighting game available for the PlayStation, with critics expressing strong opinions and criticizing the game for its graphics, uninspired combat system, and clunky controls. Fighting fans were much better served by the other 2 alternatives. The must-have for all American PlayStation early adopters was definitely Ridge Racer. Similar to Japan, this was the killer app for the PlayStation, which is why it celebrated great success at launch and Namco made a significant amount of money. Nevertheless, Sony managed to provide more and better games at the US launch than were available in Japan in December '94, which was certainly one of the advantages of the staggered release that was common at the time. It was also interesting that Sony offered the games in the USA in elongated cases, similar to how the DU Company did for games for its namesake console. In the long CD boxes were the game, a manual, and any buyback slips. However, it didn't stay that way for long. Shortly after, Sony changed the production and offered the games in standard CD cases, similar to Japan, with the manual also serving as a replacement for the front cover. For Europe, dedicated PS cases were planned, which had a slightly thicker shape and also brought the front cover back into the box. Meanwhile, Europeans eagerly looked forward to September 29th, when the PlayStation finally appeared on store shelves and was available for $599 DM in Germany. Here in the country, Sony had 10 launch titles ready, which differed in some aspects from the Japan and US launches. Thus, alongside well-known games like Battle Arena, Toshinden, Killing, Ridge Racer, Jumping Flash, Rayman, and Street Fighter the Movie, which were already available for purchase in the USA and Japan, we also got games like D. Lemmings, the shoot-'em-up Nova Storm and Rapid Reload, which is reminiscent of Gunstar Heroes and had already been released in Japan in April, found their way to the West for the European launch. Although it was never released in the USA, the most anticipated launch game besides Ridge Racer was Wipeout, the first PlayStation game from Psygnosis, which Sony had already made a first-party studio in 1993 and was actively involved in the development of the PS hardware. With Wipeout, the English delivered an excellent futuristic racing game that bore a distant resemblance to F-Zero, but placed significantly more emphasis on precise maneuvers and encouraged the use of weapons. The gameplay was complemented by lightning-fast graphics and a magnificent soundtrack that captured the spirit of the times and was certainly a contributing factor to Wipeout becoming a massive hit in Europe, standing tall alongside Ridge Racer. Thus, Europe received two must-haves, which somewhat mitigated the late release of the console and ensured that Sony could barely meet the demand in Europe. By November, Sony had sold 3 times more PlayStation consoles than Sega Saturn consoles. By the end of 1995, units were flying off the shelves in Europe, with an astonishing attach rate of 1 to 4, meaning that every PlayStation buyer took home 4 games. A complete success for Sony and a bitter reality for Sega, who struggled to gain a foothold in the West with the Saturn. In the last quarter of the year, more notable games were released, which I would like to briefly discuss. In October, PlayStation owners received Destruction Derby, a different kind of racing game that focused on intense races and brutal crash events, becoming so popular that it spawned an entire series. In November, Sony released Twisted Metal, an arena combat game that took a similar direction to Destruction Derby, but placed significantly more emphasis on action and the use of various weapons. Namco finally brought Tekken to the West, delivering the next mega hit for hungry fighting game fans. Just in time for the Christmas shopping season, 2 sequels were released in Japan in December. Namco offered a kind of upgrade to the first game with Ridge Racer Revolution. It was not a true successor, but merely offered 2 new cars, a 2-player mode, and new tracks for the soundtrack, which is why the ratings were not as positive as those for its direct predecessor. The game was supposed to be released here in May '96. However, there were more characters and content in Battle Arena Toshinden 2. The fighting game entered the next round, but offered little new in terms of gameplay and thus failed to keep up with other, more successful fighting games. A release in the West was planned for summer '96. And finally, I would like to briefly mention Suikoden, which was released in December in Japan by Konami. It was not the first JRPG for the console, but certainly one of the better representatives of the genre. Developed internally at Konami, it featured classic 2D graphics reminiscent of 16-bit consoles, which earned the game considerable criticism. Unfortunately, financial success did not come immediately. Only with the passage of time and considerable word-of-mouth promotion did Suikoden achieve the desired success and was subsequently developed into a series by Konami. Due to lengthy localization efforts, Suikoden was not set to be released in the USA until December '96 and only made its way to Europe in April '97. However, this did not affect the success of the PlayStation at all. With good marketing, an appealing price, and a great selection of games that grew month by month, Sony ensured that they held a 20% market share with the PlayStation in its first year. And this as an absolute newcomer, who was scorned by the market leader Nintendo and laughed at by Sega. But that was far from enough for Sony. Ken Kutaragi and Norioga had tasted blood. They wanted more. More sales, more success, more market share, and all of that they should achieve. In early '96, Sony had already generated around $2 billion in profit worldwide from PlayStation hardware and software sales. Not bad for a product that was not wanted by most Sony bosses and was even considered unworthy of the Sony brand as a toy right up until its release. When the money started pouring in, the managers changed their minds and Ken Kutaragi regained his reputation. Isn't it amazing what money can do? But who is surprised? The gap to Sega grew significantly faster in the West than in Japan, where the Saturn enjoyed a large fan base and continued to be very popular. However, the situation looked quite different in the USA and Europe. Anyone who wants to learn more about Sega's situation at the time should definitely check out my Sega Saturn documentary. In it, I go into detail about the many poor decisions made by Sega. And Nintendo, as you have surely noticed, has not really been mentioned in this video so far after they dropped Sony. This was mainly due to the fact that Nintendo's Ultra 64 console kept getting delayed, thus leaving the field open for Sony in the West. However, that was set to change in 1996 as the release of the Ultra 64, as the next-gen console was now called, was drawing closer. Whether Sony would actually find itself in trouble because of this remained to be seen. Japanese PlayStation owners were excited about Hideo Kojima's first game on the console when Konami released Police Nords in January, after it had already been available for Japanese home computers and the Do. The exciting graphic adventure captivated with a cinematic story, well-written characters, and cutscenes that could have come straight out of an anime. Unfortunately, Western PlayStation fans waited in vain for a March release. The game remained exclusive to Japan. In February, the sensational news from Squaresoft followed. The RPG hit supplier, which had made a name for itself primarily on the Super Nintendo, broke with this long tradition and turned its back on Nintendo. The reason was Nintendo's decision to continue relying on cartridge technology for the N64. Final Fantasy VII, originally planned for the N64, was supposed to be released on the N64 DD, delivered on more than 10 discs. However, when the development of the DD add-on stalled and Squaresoft saw no chance of fitting the XXL role-playing game onto a conventional cartridge, the developer chose the PlayStation as the new platform. The CD technology provided enough storage space to accommodate all video sequences and gameplay elements, even though Squaresoft had to split the game across multiple discs. However, the cost-effective production did not pose a significant hurdle. The departure of Squaresoft was, of course, a significant loss for Nintendo, as the numerous role-playing games were among the best that could be seen in the genre on the Super Nintendo. And many fans of role-playing games such as Final Fantasy VI, Terranigma, or Secret of Mana now had to turn to the PlayStation if they wanted to continue playing such high-caliber titles. However, this was just the beginning of a new trend that would continue throughout 1996 and would not stop. More and more developers would completely withdraw their support from Nintendo or show significantly fewer games for the Ultra 64 than they did for the SNES, but you will see that as the video progresses. In March, Western gamers received new racing game content as Need for Speed was released, a port of the original that ran significantly better than on the original console and finally brought car culture to the PlayStation, becoming so successful that several sequels were to follow. In Japan, Namco made a comeback and released the long-awaited sequel to Tekken. Tekken 2 was significantly better than the first installment, offering more fighters and refining the overall gameplay and balance, which made the series even more popular. Western fighting game fans unfortunately had to wait until late summer. I would also like to mention another major title that debuted in Japan in March, as it was set to firmly establish itself in the hearts of many gamers alongside the PlayStation. Of course, we are talking about Resident Evil, the survival horror adventure from Capcom that would set new standards and establish a new genre. Although it was not the first game of its kind with fixed camera perspectives, this honor belonged to Alone in the Dark, which was available on the Do and would also make its way to the PlayStation with its second installment. Resident Evil still played in a completely different league. It offered a significantly creepier atmosphere, better graphics, and more action sequences. In short, it was the perfect game in a new genre that was clearly aimed at adult players and set a standard with its quality that had rarely been seen in video games before. With a timely release in April, Capcom launched the game in the USA. Impatient Europeans had to resort to imports if they did not want to wait until the official release in August. Or they took the other, more illegal route. For what also flooded the PlayStation market in early '96 were the first mod chips that allowed burned games to be played. Once installed, it was possible to burn original PS games onto a CDR and play them without issues on the modified console, which of course saved money and contributed to the growing popularity of PS consoles and games. Although Sony had implemented a copy protection system when they launched the PlayStation, it was precisely the deliberately integrated region lock that led to the emergence of such mod chips. Originally, the chips were intended to bypass the region lock and thus, for example, making Japanese games playable on Western consoles was not enough for some resourceful hackers in 2001, and shortly thereafter, it became possible to play those backup copies with new mod chips. However, this circumstance did not harm the success of the PlayStation, rather, it had the opposite effect. Consoles continued to be sold, but the games were mostly rented from video stores, burned, and then enjoyed at a low cost, provided one had the money for a PC with a CD burner. But well, let's leave these pirate waters and turn our attention to other, more interesting new releases and events that made 1996 a successful year for Sony. In May, Motortoon Grand Prix 2 was released in Japan, once again programmed by Sony's own Japan studio, specifically by Polis Entertainment, a small team within the Japan studio. The arcade racer was a solid successor that improved the racing game in every aspect, which led Sony to decide to release the game in the West at the end of the year. After the release of Motortoon Grand Prix, designer Kasunori Yamauchi wasted no time and poured all his experience and knowledge into the next project. This time he wanted to produce a racing game that would feature more realistic driving behavior and a lot of licenses. Also in May, the second E took place. Sony spoke at the accompanying press conference about the great success of the PlayStation, presented sales figures, and even announced a price reduction at the end of the presentation. Soon, the PlayStation would be available for $119, which of course was also a message directed at Nintendo, who planned to release the Ultra 64 for $119 in the USA in September of that year. Of course, there were brand new games to see, as Sony wanted to provide fans and the press with enough reasons why the PlayStation was still the best place for gaming fun. Another first-party title was showcased, which was named Crash Bandicoot. The game was developed by Naughty Dog, a small studio that did not exactly make a name for itself with the fighting game Way of the Warrior. Crash Bandicoot looked very promising, which could also be said for Jumping Flash, even though not much had changed in the overall gameplay formula. You were still navigating in the first-person view, which continues to make the jump and run unique. Squaresoft showcased the first material for Final Fantasy VII, Psygnosis brought Wipeout XL, and Core Design presented a very promising action-adventure game, Tomb Raider, in which the attractive Lara Croft would take the lead role and aim to shake up a predominantly male genre. After the E, things calmed down a bit. There were a few smaller releases before the promising jump-and-run game Crash Indigo by Naughty Dog launched in August, fulfilling, if not exceeding, all expectations. The developers succeeded in creating a character with Crash who quickly became a sort of mascot for PlayStation, and the game itself was also quite impressive. Designed as a linear jump and run, players had to hop through various levels in the role of the marsupial and try to reach the end of the level safely. It was not a Super Mario 64 in terms of gameplay, which revolutionized the genre at the time, but it was the best jump and run on the PlayStation so far and quickly became a mega hit, prompting Naughty Dog to start working on the sequel. As a sort of response to Nintendo's ambitious 1080 snowboarding, Cool Borders was released, introducing the trendy sport on the PlayStation and also becoming a success. Here too, the developers expanded the game into a whole series that was exclusive to the PlayStation. And in Japan, Squaresoft released the first PS game, even though Tubal No One was different from what one would expect from the RPG studio. It was not a role-playing game, but a fighting game that impressed with character designs by Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, and was set to be released in the USA in October and in Europe in January of the following year. Speaking of October, 3 more top titles were released: Destruction Derby, Vandal Hearts, and Wipeout 2097, all of which should not be missing from any PS collection. PS owners certainly could not complain about a lack of software supply. In contrast, Nintendo, which had a strong US launch, was now struggling with the issue of too few games being released. Squaresoft, Konami, Capcom, and other developers were much more focused on releasing their games on the PlayStation. All partners who had successfully collaborated with Nintendo in the past were increasingly turning their backs on the console giant, as success was clearly on Sony's side, and Sony was aware of this. On November 1st, 1996, the PlayStation Expo took place, an in-house event that was set to feature some great news and surprises. Sony announced the dual analog controller. On one hand, the publisher had not overlooked the developments in the 3D area, and it needed a means to better control three-dimensional games. On the other hand, it also wanted to respond to Nintendo, which had released the revolutionary analog stick with the N. The dual analog controller featured, as the name suggested, 2 analog sticks, which naturally provided game developers with more options to move characters and the camera. New trailers for Final Fantasy VII and Gran Turismo were shown. The former made it clear what a potential hit was being developed at Squaresoft, while the latter provided insights into the new racing game. The biggest game announcement, however, came from Capcom. Resident Evil 2 was officially announced and immediately created excitement for more, but the release was still a while away. PlayStation fans didn't have much time to mourn. November brought a total of 27 new releases, which meant almost a new game per day, with Disruptor and Tomb Raider definitely being the highlights. Disruptor was an interesting first-person shooter from the young development studio Insomniac Games, which, like Naughty Dog, was supported by Vivendi and thus released their first game on PlayStation. Disruptor was quite solid, offering good graphics and a smooth gameplay experience. However, it wasn't enough to achieve success. Disruptor remained stuck on the shelves like lead, and Insomniac had to worry about its survival already. Fortunately, Vivendi gave the developer a second chance, as we will see later. Tomb Raider was a different story. The action-adventure hit like a bomb and turned the heroine Lara Croft into a true icon almost overnight. In addition to the main character, the graphics and the overall gameplay were also highly praised. In the skin of the young archaeologist, the adventure took her through various abandoned temples in search of treasures, turning Tomb Raider into a playable Indiana Jones adventure and ensuring that Lara Croft would definitely receive a sequel. December had fewer games to offer, but significantly more notable hits were released, such as Battle Arena, Toshinden, 3 Capcom titles, Mega Man 8, Parappa the Rapper, the third Ridge Racer game, which received a new name and a somewhat more realistic and thus darker graphic with Rage Racer, a new fighting game from Namco called Soul Blade that focused on weapons, and Wild Arms, which was published by Sony and represented a classic JRPG set in the Wild West. All these games, the constant supply of software, the increasingly affordable mod chips, and Sony's efforts to attract more developers ultimately led to the sale of 9 million PlayStation consoles by 1996, with 3 million sold in the USA and 2.2 million in Europe. Sony suddenly had a 40% market share, which Sega particularly felt. In the West, it was no longer Sony against Sega. The new competitor was Nintendo. And with the Nintendo 64, which performed sensationally in the USA and awaited its European release in March 1997, the PlayStation was on par by the end of the year, at least in terms of hardware sales during the Christmas season. The real showdown would take place in 1997, and Sony had an ace up its sleeve that would be released early in the year and ultimately initiate the triumphant march of the PlayStation. While Nintendo had to start the year 1997 with a software slump, the most anticipated PlayStation game, Final Fantasy VII, was released in Japan. Squaresoft released the Mammoth RPG at the very beginning of the year in January, making a statement in several ways. On one hand, it was one of the best, largest, and also most important games that had been released on Sony's console so far. On the other hand, it was the continuation of a game series that had made its way to Nintendo platforms and was now continuing its victorious march on a competing console that Nintendo had essentially created itself. Of course, even before that, major development studios had already migrated to Sony, leaving Nintendo out in the rain, such as Capcom, which had released Mega Man 8 on the PlayStation the previous year, had not experienced a developer departure as severe as that of Squaresoft. Final Fantasy VII elevated the JRPG genre to the next level with its high-quality, captivating story and likable characters, setting a new standard against which future role-playing games had to measure. In March, the next blow to Nintendo came, as Konami also continued its most well-known series with Symphony of the Night not on the N, but on the PlayStation. Once again designed as a D game, the new Castlevania, however, took a different direction than its 68-bit predecessors. While these were still linear action platformers, Symphony of the Night was more oriented towards the gameplay principle of Super Metroid. In the skin of Alucard, one explored an entire castle and enjoyed an open gameplay mechanic that required the use of new abilities to progress in the game. Although the major success was absent at launch, the new gameplay concept grew with an increasing number of new players and soon became the standard for all subsequent Castlevania games, establishing a completely new genre of Metroidvanias alongside Metroid. Konami did not completely distance itself from Nintendo and would soon announce the first Castlevania for the system, but that is a topic for another video. A week before Castlevania, another game from Squaresoft, Bushido Blade, was released, even though they had not developed it in-house. It was once again a fighting game, although it went in a different direction than Tobe No. 1, which Squaresoft had already released on the PlayStation. Bushido Blade was quite special in a way, and skillfully stood out from the rest of the genre representatives with its gameplay mechanics. It was arguably the most realistic fighting game to date, emphasizing weapon combat where few maneuvers could lead to victory. To this day, it remains one of the most interesting fighting games for Sony's console and was set to receive a sequel during the PS era. Just 1 month later, Squaresoft followed up and released Tobe No. Up 2. At the same time, the dual analog controller was introduced, which the new fighting game utilized. Unfortunately, Squaresoft decided against a release in the West this time, much to the dismay of many fans who once again had to resort to importing or using their home CD burner. Sony was also active and had the action-adventure Alundra from Matrix Software in April. Unlike Final Fantasy VII, Alundra continued to follow a traditional graphic style which suited the game very well. Quickly, Alundra gathered many fans and was regarded as the Zelda alternative for the PlayStation, as players also visited various dungeons and had to solve puzzles while engaging in an action-packed combat system against various enemies. It was a game that would also achieve great success in the West, even though it was no longer distributed by Sony there and was set to be released the following year. But let's stay briefly with Sony. In April 1997, the company announced that Ken Kutaragi would take on the role of CEO at Sony Computer Entertainment America. The officials who had demanded his dismissal 8 years earlier now handed him the reins for the division he had made so important with his work. It was the rise of an outsider, but it was so well deserved. In June, Squaresoft released the fourth title of the year, marking the second Final Fantasy game. This time, however, it was a tactical RPG that aimed to impress with its deep combat system and a more serious story. However, for inexplicable reasons, the Japanese decided against a release in Europe, even though the game would receive a fully localized version in the USA. Now let's take a look at Los Angeles, as the E3 took place in 1997, exceptionally not in May but in June, and Sony had a handful of heavyweights present. New footage of Final Fantasy VII was released, which was set to debut in the West in September and October. Meanwhile, Naughty Dog had footage of the highly anticipated Crash sequel, which looked impressive and promised a more refined gaming experience. And speaking of sequels, Core Design showcased Tomb Raider 2, which seemed to be even bigger, prettier, and better than the already fantastic first installment. The most interesting was by far the new game from Konami called Metal Gear Solid. The tactical espionage adventure crafted by Hideo Kojima aimed to elevate video games to a new level and tell a story akin to those found in major blockbusters, all wrapped in an atmospheric graphics style that was unmatched on the PlayStation. But it would take at least another year before players could step into the shoes of Solid Snake. In the meantime, PlayStation owners could pass the time with new releases, as they appeared in abundance and many of them were of very high quality. It would be too much to discuss all the new games, but I would still like to mention a few important titles. While the dates mentioned here are the original release dates, it means that most games were first released in Japan and the USA before eventually making their way to US in Europe at a later time. But that's just a side note. If you're wondering why I'm talking about a game that you surely know was released later for us, From Software revved up the engines of their virtual mechs in July when the studio released their third PS game, taking a distinctly different direction with Armored Core compared to their King's Field series. Armored Core was an action-packed mech shooter that put you in the cockpit of a massive battle robot. The game was a huge success, especially in Japan, which is known for its gaming culture, leading From Software to expand it into a series that would last for decades. The latest Armored Core game was released last year for Xbox Series, PlayStation, and PC. Also in July, Squaresoft released the fifth game in a row and brought another series to the PlayStation that had previously been at home on Game Boy and Super Famicom. Saga Frontier was a classic JRPG that featured a unique narrative structure and offered several playable characters from which the player had to choose a hero at the beginning. Unfortunately, Saga Frontier was also never released in Europe, leading to a questionable release policy that would deprive Europeans of more great role-playing gems, as you will see. Capcom continued the popular Mega Man X series in August on the PlayStation. The first 3 Mega Man X games had also been released on the Super Nintendo and had caused quite a stir. With Mega Man X, Capcom separated the series from Nintendo and later released the action platformer in the USA and Europe, although Mega Man X was considered by fans to be the weakest entry in the series so far. In the same month, Oddworld Abe's Odyssey was released, an interesting genre mix of adventure, puzzle game, and D-jump run, which not only offered a dark atmosphere but also introduced Abe, a character that would be associated with the PlayStation for a long time. And then it finally happened. In the USA, Final Fantasy VII was released in September 1997, making the Japanese role-playing game genre finally respectable in the West. Sony took over the global distribution rights, which clearly demonstrated the importance and significance of the game for the PlayStation platform. As in Japan, Final Fantasy VII also became a mega hit in the USA, overshadowing all other role-playing games from which many could not escape. And while Americans were traveling with Cloud in Midgar, Japanese PlayStation fans were excited about another Capcom game that celebrated its origins and early successes on the Super Nintendo. With Breath of Fire 3, the publisher finally brought the popular role-playing game series into the next generation, although the transition to the upbeat era did not seem as significant as it did with Final Fantasy VII. In October, there was a new supply for all fans of Naughty Dog's Bandicoot, as Crash Bandicoot 2 was released in the USA and launched with even better gameplay, more levels and variations within them, as well as a not-so-high difficulty level. At that time, Crash had risen to become the mascot of PlayStation, even though there were other candidates like Lara Croft and Ape. Naughty Dog and Sony capitalized on Crash's popularity in numerous advertising campaigns, with the most famous ad likely being the one where Crash challenges Mario to a direct duel. Oh yes, I somehow missed the old marketing of those years. In November, Tomb Raider 2 was released and it was the perfect sequel. It improved the adventure surrounding the sexy archaeologist in every aspect and was once again one of those titles that appealed to a more mature audience, bringing video games a bit more into the mainstream. The creators of Bomberman at Hudson Soft sent Bloody Roar into the ring to take on Tekken, Toshinden, and others. Bloody Roar featured a unique gameplay mechanic where all fighters could transform into animals at the push of a button, which not only increased the move repertoire but also added a level of strategy, quickly gaining fans in the genre. At the same time, Sony released the DualShock controller, a meaningful evolution of the dual analog controller. This controller featured outwardly curved analog sticks and 2 rumble motors, which were embedded in the grips of the controller, guaranteeing a more immersive gaming experience. European gamers and PlayStation owners, everything else was secondary, as Final Fantasy VII finally released here in November. It was not only the most highly anticipated PS role-playing game, but also the first Final Fantasy game ever sold in Europe by Squaresoft. And this was even completely with German texts, although the translation left much to be desired. And of course, we must disregard Mystic Quest Legend here, which did not carry the Final Fantasy branding in our country. December brought 4 absolute heavyweights, but unfortunately it did not come without sad news from Japan. Sony mourned the passing of Masaru Ibuka, who died at the age of 89 on December 19, 1997. The founder of Sony transformed a small electronics company from post-war Japan into a globally operating corporation that now also successfully competes in the video game business. But let's take a quick look at the new releases in the last month of the year, as they were truly impressive. Capcom combined its Mega Man series with the JRPG genre and released an interesting role-playing game called Mega Man Legends, which skillfully mixed both the Mega Man franchise and the role-playing game genre, enjoying great popularity. And speaking of role-playing games, Namco followed in the footsteps of Squaresoft and Capcom and continued the role-playing game series that was born on the Super Famicom with Tales of Destiny. Once again, the developers relied on 2-dimensional pixel graphics, which, in direct comparison to Final Fantasy VII, naturally fell short, but entertained fans with its great story and action-packed combat system. Namco also had a completely new game in December. With Klonoa, the publisher released a charming platformer that, while it did not win any innovation awards, was able to captivate genre fans with its great graphics, charming main character, and successful gameplay loop. The true highlight of December was clearly Gran Turismo. The racing game offered an enormous scope for its time, with dozens of licensed vehicles and an excellent driving behavior that had not been seen in any other console racing game before. Gran Turismo quickly captured the hearts of many PlayStation fans in the land of the rising sun and was set to sell even better than it did when it was released in May '98, eventually becoming the most successful PS game over the following years. Thus, Sony closed the year '97 with nearly 28 million sold PlayStation consoles. During the same period, Sega was only able to sell just under 9 million Saturn systems, while Nintendo achieved a total of 14 million sales with the N. By this point, it was clear that it seemed nearly impossible to catch up with Sony, but not everything was lost yet. The following year, Nintendo aimed to release several high-profile titles such as Banjo-Kazooie, Turok 2, and Zelda Ocarina of Time in order to close the gap with Sony. And Sega even planned a completely new console that was supposed to easily outclass the PlayStation. Sony had to brace itself in order to maintain or even expand its well-deserved 50% market share. With 1998, one of the strongest years, if not the strongest year in the history of video games, began in terms of both the sheer number and quality of high-profile games affecting all 3 hardware providers. It was also the 4th year for Sony, and the PlayStation continued to thrive despite a significant piracy problem. Games were borrowed, burned, and played illegally on modded consoles. It was harder to find an untouched console on the used market than a PlayStation with a built-in mod chip. One would think that game developers would avoid the system, fearing that their games would not be sold but rather distributed illegally. But it was exactly the opposite. The PlayStation broke all records, became the hot thing among teenagers by the end of the year, and games continued to come out at such a rapid pace that it became difficult to give all the top titles the necessary attention and time. Thus, Squaresoft continued to ride the wave of Final Fantasy VII hype and released the tactical hit Final Fantasy Tactics in the USA in January, while Capcom launched the next blockbuster with Resident Evil 2, managing to bring the survival horror game to market in Japan and the USA within just 7 days. Resident Evil 2 offered the proven gameplay formula but elevated the game mechanics to the next level with 2 distinct campaigns, a better story, and a large police station to explore, cementing its place as one of the greatest games of all time in the hearts of fans. In February and March, Squaresoft followed up in Japan by offering 2 RPGs that could not have been more different. While Xenogears began as a prototype for Final Fantasy VII, Squaresoft ultimately rolled out the game as a standalone title, creating an ambitious mech role-playing game that presented the question of creation as a central story element. It was developed by a team at Squaresoft that would soon separate and release further milestones, first for Namco and later for Nintendo as Monolith Soft. At the end of the year, a US release of Xenogears was imminent, but unfortunately, Squaresoft withheld the game from US Europeans. The same happened with Parasite Eve, which was released in March and mixed the RPG genre with survival horror elements. It was a dark and cinematic game that had not been seen before from Squaresoft and made a significant impact. Namco released Tekken 3 in the same month, creating the best installment of the successful fighting game series to date, before the West finally got to enjoy Gran Turismo in May. The game developed a real momentum in America and Europe and was even expected to surpass Final Fantasy in terms of pure sales figures in the coming months. By the end of the PS era, Gran Turismo was set to sell over 10 million copies, making it the most successful PlayStation game of all time. From May 28th Han to 30th, the E took place again in Los Angeles. But before we talk about Sony's contribution to the event, we need to take a look at Sega, who held the Sega New Challenge Conference a week earlier and unveiled the Sega Dreamcast. Sega's next-gen console offered significantly better hardware and a graphical splendor that left mouths agape. It was clearly Sega's attempt to regain the console market, and the Dreamcast promised to be an amazing product. At E3, all eyes were on Sega and their tech demos and first gameplay trailers, while Nintendo also showcased a few hot titles such as Zelda, Rare's Banjo-Kazooie, the lightning-fast F-Zero X, and Pokémon games that had already taken Japan by storm. There were definitely some high-profile titles that would surely convince some PlayStation owners of the qualities of the N. But Sony's E-lineup was also impressive, featuring not only the already well-known and highly anticipated Metal Gear Solid from Konami, but also the new game from Insomniac Games and the sequel to Final Fantasy. Insomniac's next title was not a sequel to the solid but poorly received Disruptor, but rather an ambitious jump-and-run that featured the little dragon Spyro as the hero, and aimed to show that fans of the genre could be satisfied not only on the N. As for Final Fantasy, the announcement of the 8th installment naturally sparked cheers and the associated hype among role-playing game fans and PlayStation owners. The rest of the year once again consisted of a plethora of brand new titles and sequels to successful Super Nintendo games, which, like many games before, found a new home on the PlayStation. In June, an open-world game by DMA excited the PlayStation community, allowing players to control a gangster from a bird's-eye view, freely moving around a city, completing missions, or simply causing chaos. GTA, as the game was called, offered unprecedented freedom and simultaneously marked the beginning of a video game series that would go on to break many records. In July, players hit the track with Colin McRae Rally, a racing game that put intense off-road and rally action in the spotlight and thrilled with sensational gameplay, while RPG fans could dive into the new Star Ocean game. With Tenchu, a unique stealth game set in feudal Japan, was released in August, throwing players into the role of a ninja who carried out missions under the cover of shadows and eliminated various enemies. Tenchu was once again aimed at older games and demonstrated once more that the PlayStation was a system that could successfully unite different target groups, unlike the competition from Nintendo. This was also evident in September. Younger PlayStation owners and young-at-heart platforming fans enjoyed Spyro the Dragon, the new game from Insomniac, which impressed with its charming character, colorful world, and successful gameplay mechanics, while older gamers spent their money on Metal Gear Solid, which fulfilled the promises made earlier and even exceeded expectations. Hideo Kojima finally made his mark in the gaming world, and his structure, narrative style, and high production value were unmatched at that time. October brought more top hits. Naughty Dog released Crash Bandicoot Warped, marking the third and, in the eyes of many fans, the best installment in the series. It was varied, offering diverse side quests that loosened the overall jump-and-run principle, and continued the success of Crash Bandicoot, even though the developers were slowly getting tired of the pouch badger. With Medieval, the PlayStation received a quirky action-adventure, and along with it, the next video game hero that would be associated with the PlayStation brand for a time. And speaking of mascots, Abe made his second appearance in Oddworld, Abe's Exodus, which was heavily based on its predecessor and offered nothing new, yet still entertained fans. And for those who loved intense action, Twisted Metal was a must-play, which to this day is considered by many PlayStation fans to be the best installment in the entire series. Then November arrived, and while European and American PlayStation owners immersed themselves in the role of Lara Croft in her third adventure, searching for pieces of a meteorite, Japan was already playing next-generation games, as the Sega Dreamcast was released there on November 27th. The PlayStation was no longer the technically best console on the market, and many PlayStation exclusive brands, such as the aforementioned Tomb Raider, were already in development for Dreamcast. Thus, Sony had a next-gen problem to solve, at least in Japan, especially since the Dreamcast was set to launch in the West next year. Many manufacturers remained loyal to the PlayStation, such as Namco, which released not only the best game in the series, Ridge Racer Type 4, in December, but also one of the best races in the entire PS game library. And Konami released Suikoden 2, which had a rather modest start but gradually gained more fans over time. By the end of 1998, Sony had recorded over 50 million sold consoles. That was nearly 22 million more than last year, while Sega languished with around 9 million Saturn sales, and Nintendo counted just 20 million sold systems, achieving not even half of what Sony could boast. They had once again dominated, but the environment had changed. In Japan, the Dreamcast was celebrated, and Nintendo was expected to provide the first information about its successor, by next year at the latest. The world looked to Sony and wondered how the company would respond to the new circumstances and whether the PlayStation would continue to stay at the top. Throughout the PlayStation lifecycle, several years played a key role, such as 1991 when Nintendo broke with Sony, or 1994 when the PlayStation celebrated its release. 1999 was also such a year, although one must look a bit closer to recognize the key moments. But before I reveal them to you, I want to look back at the first 2 months of the year, as these two offered absolute heavyweights and a piece of hardware that could be seen as a response to Sega's Dreamcast. In January, Siphon Filter was released, an action-packed spy game developed by the American studio Eidetic, which quickly gained many fans on the PlayStation. The studio previously delivered one of the worst games of all time with Bubs D, but was able to more than redeem its reputation with the third-person shooter. Siphon Filter was set to become another PlayStation exclusive series that targeted a more mature audience. In 2000, Eidetic was acquired by Sony and renamed Sony Bend. Most people will likely associate the name with the PlayStation 4 exclusive Days Gone. In Japan, the Pocket Station was launched in the same month and was the piece of hardware mentioned earlier that bore a striking resemblance to the VMU of the Sega Dreamcast. Essentially, the Pocket Station was a mix of a memory card and a dedicated handheld device with buttons and a small monochrome display. This allowed owners of the Pocket Station to save their game progress or load small mini-games directly onto the device to play on the go, although this was only permitted for games with extra Pocket Station compatibility. Unfortunately, there were not many of them, as the device was originally planned for the West but ultimately remained exclusive to Japan. In February, Squaresoft released the highly anticipated sequel to Final Fantasy VII in Japan, which, as expected, was not a direct continuation but rather a completely standalone game that impressed with better graphics, a new story, and well-written characters. This further established Squaresoft as more than just the go-to RPG supplier for PlayStation owners. Western Final Fantasy fans had to wait until September to get their hands on it, as Squaresoft wanted to fully localize Final Fantasy VIII. In March, Sony presented its current business report, which included some interesting figures. The company announced that the PlayStation had sold an incredible 21.6 million units in the fiscal year 98, which ended in March 99. It was the fourth record in a row since the release of the console at the end of 1904 and the 90th. Overall, Sony was able to count 54.47 million sold PlayStation consoles, which was simply sensational for a newcomer and its first console. The reason for this was, of course, not only the technology used but also the game offerings. A console could be excellent, but if no good games were produced for it, the best hardware would be of no use. In this area, Sony had done everything right. The chosen medium of the CD, along with the more relaxed licensing and release policies compared to Sega and Nintendo, were the main drivers for a continuous supply of software from renowned development studios. What Sony could not know at the time was the fact that fiscal year 98 would be the last year where Sony would see an increase in hardware sales compared to the competition. Starting from April 1st, 1999, marking the beginning of the new fiscal year, the PlayStation would enter a downward trend that would continue until the discontinuation of the console. Yes, we are still talking about millions of consoles sold, but from this point on, one can speak of a steady decline in PlayStation sales figures. The reasons for this can be easily inferred. Japan had been in the next generation for about 5 months and was celebrating the Sega Dreamcast, which was also set to launch in the USA in September. But the most important reason for the downward trend was provided by Sony with the announcement of the PlayStation 2 itself. The successor was set to be released in early 2000 in Japan, which naturally dampened the demand for Sony's current console. But it also dampened the demand for the Sega Dreamcast. Interested PlayStation owners who were already considering switching to Sega's new console hesitated and preferred to save their money for the PlayStation 2, which Sega felt quite acutely, as you will learn in my Sega Dreamcast documentary. Feel free to check it out if you haven't seen the video yet. But the announcement of the PlayStation 2 did not mean that everything came to a standstill. Month after month, more top hits were released for the console. 1999 was set to be an exceptionally strong year. Konami released a brand new game that would define the horror genre alongside Resident Evil on the PlayStation. However, Silent Hill took a different direction than Capcom's zombie shockers. Here, PlayStation owners encountered psychological horror, a gameplay mechanic that had not really been seen in a video game before. In combination with the fixed camera perspectives, the dense atmosphere, and the eerie enemies, Silent Hill truly struck a chord and became a blockbuster for Konami. In April, the journey continued with Saga Frontschloss, which was to be published by Squaresoft in Japan and later in the West. By the way, Saga Frontschule was the first game in the series to be released in Europe and thus in Germany. It did not reach the success of other role-playing games, which is why there was never a third installment. In May, the E once again opened its doors, and of course the fair was entirely focused on the next generation of consoles. Sega brought a bunch of Sega Dreamcast games, Sony showcased PS tech demos, and even Nintendo spoke for the first time about the N successor, although there was only a small presentation and a few pieces of information from Howard Lincoln to see or hear. But of course, there were also some exciting PS games featured, such as Tony Hawk Pro Skater, which was developed by Neversoft and was set to be released simultaneously on PlayStation and Nintendo. The Trend Sports game made a good impression, although it was still uncertain whether it would be able to captivate players in the long run. Starting in September, PlayStation's owners could see for themselves. With Ape Escape, Sony showcased a first-party title that could only be played with the new DualShock controller. The jump-and-run game tasked players with going on a monkey hunt in various areas, using the net to catch the primates and other items with the right analog stick, while the character was controlled with the left analog stick. Capcom showcased the next horror shocker, which, however, had nothing to do with zombies, but instead had the protagonist fighting against prehistoric enemies. The game was called Dino Crisis and offered the familiar colorful, fixed camera perspectives, item management, and plenty of blood and horror moments that players had come to expect from Resident Evil. The biggest highlight by far was Gran Turismo 2, which aimed to shine with even more content, more modes, and more vehicles. Japan Studios Poly Entertainment had since separated and rebranded itself as Polyphony Digital, a studio that would operate as an independent first-party studio under Sony, and was behind the scenes designing one of the best racing games of all time. After the E, PlayStation owners were excited about hundreds of new games that would be released by the end of the year, including at least 25 top hits, which I would like to briefly mention here, as I would surely be lynched in the comments if I didn't. It all started in June with Ape Escape, which I mentioned earlier. Additionally, Grandia was launched, a port of the Sega Saturn original that told the story of the young adventurer Justin and his heroic journey. Grandia was not the most visually impressive role-playing game, but it captivated players with an exciting storyline and incredibly well-written characters. It was a JRPG that found great success in all three markets after Sega of America decided against a release in the West on the Saturn. And with Driver, PlayStation owners received a racing game that featured one of the most challenging prologue sections of all time in a video game. Inspired by the 1978 film of the same name, players took on the role of undercover cop John Tanner and had to prove themselves in many action-packed missions set in 4 American metropolises. Through its exciting story and unique racing gameplay, Driver made a name for itself, leading to several sequels. In June, Dino Crisis was released and was celebrated by survival horror fans, although the game never reached the popularity of Resident Evil, which led Capcom to decide to change the gameplay formula in the sequel to a more action-oriented direction. Konami released Vandal Hearts 2, the sequel to their tactical RPG, and Squaresoft once again brought the latest installment of a series that had celebrated great success on the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation. Although unfortunately, Legend of Mana was only set to be released in Japan and the USA. Unfortunately, Europeans had to wait 22 years. The game was only released in 2021 on PlayStation, Nintendo Switch, and PC. In August, action-adventure fans were excited about Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, the second installment of the Blood Omen series. While the predecessor was an RPG in the style of Diablo, Soul Reaver took a different approach and at times resembled Nintendo's Zelda series. Additionally, the Battle Arena Toshinden series entered its 4th round, being marketed simply as Toshinden. It had a loyal fanbase but was never able to match the success of Tekken 3. On September 9, 1999, the Sega Dreamcast was launched in the USA, accompanied by a massive marketing campaign that drew the attention of the video game industry. In response, Sony launched a fireworks display of new releases in September, including 3 first-party titles and numerous top hits from partners. Thus, Final Fantasy VIII was released quite coincidentally on the same day as the Sega Dreamcast in the USA. Although the role-playing game did not make the same waves as its successor, it was still snatched up by retailers. Naughty Dog released their last Crash Bandicoot game before ending their collaboration with Vivendi and began working on Jak and Daxter for Sony, soon becoming a first-party studio. Crash Team Racing, however, departed from the tried-and-true jump and run formula and set out to compete with Mario Kart. The result was arguably the best kart racer on the PlayStation. Squaresoft gathered its courage and released its Front Mission series with the 3rd installment in the West, which was to happen only a year after the Japan release. The tactical role-playing game offered challenging mech turn-based battles, an exciting political storyline, and a plethora of customization options that could overwhelm beginners. Capcom did not rest long on the success of Dino Crisis and launched Resident Evil 3 in September, which told the story of Jill Valentine and her survival in Raccoon City. And with Wild Arms 2 and Wipeout 3, there were 2 more first-party games on the shelves, catering to 2 different genres and being high-quality games in their own right. Although October was not as strong in terms of the sheer number of top titles, games like Spyro 2, Twisted Metal 4, Medal of Honor, and GTA 2 were still released, all of which would leave a lasting impression on the video game industry. GTA 2 introduced the open-world formula that would break all records with GTA 3 on the PlayStation, and Medal of Honor was finally an outstanding first-person shooter that was available exclusively on the PlayStation. It was a game in a genre that had previously celebrated great successes on the PC and to some extent on Nintendo. Now players were especially enviously glancing towards the PlayStation. The Christmas shopping season kicked off in November, and with Alundra 2 and a new James Bond game, there were 2 titles on the horizon that unfortunately did not meet expectations. Alundra 2 offered such a strong deviation from the popular first installment that fans left the game disappointed on the shelf. Unfortunately, the first Bond game under Electronic Arts was nothing more than a straightforward and uninspired third-person shooter that could not come close to the quality that fans recognized in Rare's GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. Fortunately, it was different for Chrono Cross and Tomb Raider 4, even though the really big hits were also absent here. Squaresoft's role-playing game offered a heart-wrenching story and plenty of high-quality JRPG content. Although some fans were not entirely on board with the new direction of the Chrono Trigger sequel, Tomb Raider 4 once again offered very good action-adventure content, even though Lara Croft's adventures seemed to be wearing thin, as the same gameplay formula was presented without significant innovations. In December, Sony had 2 first-party hits ready. One of them was Sony's first own JRPG. The Legend of Dragoon was developed by Sony's Japan studio and offered a classic good versus evil story set in an imaginative world, featuring charming characters who sought to prevent the destruction of this world. The combat system stood out the most, as it offered turn-based battles and included a type of quick-time event. Certain buttons had to be pressed during an attack. If successful, the enemies took more damage, which brought a touch of sophistication to the genre. Unfortunately, The Legend of Dragoon was initially released only in Japan. The USA had to wait until the following year, and in Europe it wasn't until 2001 that it became available. Sony solved this differently with their second first-party game. Gran Turismo 2 was released almost simultaneously in Japan and America. An EU release followed in January. As expected, Polyphony Digital created an absolute mega hit that thrilled racing game fans and sold over 9 million copies, making it the third best-selling game of all time for PlayStation, right after Gran Turismo and Final Fantasy VII. Noteworthy in December 1999 were Parasite Eve 2 and Valkyrie Profile, both role-playing games from Squaresoft, which completed an absurd release marathon. Sony ended the year with nearly 70% market share and over 70 million sold PS consoles. It seemed as if no one could stop the PlayStation. No one but Sony itself. In early 2000, the video game industry looked to Japan, where Sony was preparing for the launch of the PlayStation 2. But the PS was still in high demand, both among fans and developers. This certainly surprised no one, as we are talking about an install base of 70 million consoles, and thus also video game players who were willing to spend more money on good games. However, you will soon see that 2000 would be the last year in which major new titles would be released for PlayStation. Starting from the release of the PlayStation 2, developers shifted their focus to the new console. But hey, we are not there yet. Let's take a look at the first 2 months of the new millennium. 4FX was the first to launch and offered an action-adventure experience that was not far removed from Capcom's survival horror games. However, it featured a unique cel-shading graphic style that was not often seen at the time, giving the game a comic-like appearance. Speaking of Capcom and survival horror, Resident Evil Survivor launched in Japan before the game was set to be released in Europe in March. However, this was not a Resident Evil in the classical sense, but rather a light gun shooter. The main character moved through various locations, on rails, and had to shoot zombies and other monsters with a light gun. Those who did not own a light gun could also play the game with the controller. However, the enjoyment of the game suffered because it was not as intuitive to control as with the gun. A first-party game and an exclusive role-playing game from Squaresoft were set to be purchased in January, with Siphon Filter 2 initially released only in the USA and Vagrant Story available on store shelves in Japan. The RPG particularly stood out with its mature storyline, well-developed characters, and a unique combat system that involved targeting the opponent's limbs to defeat them. In March, Sony once again presented official figures. The PlayStation sold a remarkable 18.6 million units in fiscal year 99, which represented a decline of 14% when compared to the figures from the previous fiscal year. It was the first decline for Sony since the launch of the PlayStation, but the company was not really upset. They were still selling significantly more units than the competition, and the PlayStation was already poised for action. In 2000, when the PlayStation 2 was released in Japan, there was no stopping the fans. Long lines formed outside the department stores. While the willingness to buy the PS was still relatively subdued, fans knew what to expect from the PS2, and the West was already quite eager, even though it would still take a good 6 months. However, this is not about the PS, that is a topic for another video. Nevertheless, the release of its successor should have a noticeable impact on the popularity and sales figures of the PS. In April, Capcom released 2 RPGs, Breath of Fire 4 and Mega Man Legends 2, both sequels to popular games, that found many fans on the PlayStation. A month later, Capcom even released Mega Man X. The developers aimed to address the weaknesses of its predecessor and restore Mega Man X to its former glory. In the end, it didn't become a major hit, which was attributed to the somewhat outdated gameplay formula that was criticized by many members of the press. With the PS in tow, which broke all records in the land of the rising sun, Sony traveled to Los Angeles in May. The fair was clearly focused on the next generation of consoles, even though the battle was once again fought between Sega and Sony. Nintendo continued to focus more intensively on endgames, while Microsoft stayed completely away from the fair as an exhibitor, even though the tech giant from the USA was also planning a home console and was actively engaging in discussions with developers like Capcom and Bungie behind the scenes of the event. Sony showcased a spectacular trailer for the highly anticipated Metal Gear Solid 2 at E! The graphics, the amount of small details, and the overall presentation literally had viewers on the edge of their seats. Sony's announcement to offer the PlayStation 2 for a purchase price of $299 in the West, and to bring a total of 51 games to stores for the Christmas season sent fans into a frenzy, which did not go unnoticed by Sega. The Dreamcast suddenly felt like an old shoe that no one wanted to wear anymore. In addition to Metal Gear Solid 2 and Tech Tournament, which was presented by Namco for the PS, Sony, in collaboration with Squaresoft, showcased material for the US version of Chrono Cross and images for the highly anticipated Final Fantasy IX, which aimed to take fans back into a medieval fantasy world and revive old virtues. After the E! PS owners could look forward to numerous great games while waiting for the Western release of the PlayStation 2, with many of the games mentioned here having first been released in Japan and later set to be published in the USA and Europe. In contrast, Colin McRae Rally and Destruction Derby Raw were launched first in Europe and only came out in the USA at the end of 2000, while the Japanese were left hoping for a release in vain. In direct comparison, the challenging Colin McRae Rally was clearly the better game, which was also reflected in the ratings. However, its fans still found the third Destruction Derby installment in July, when Squaresoft unleashed Final Fantasy IX in Japan, completing the trilogy. In contrast, Sony responded to the declining hardware sales by launching the PS, a smaller, more compact version of the PlayStation 1 that was cheaper to produce and aimed to attract first-time buyers who had previously avoided the console with a discounted price. The selling point for the PS then appeared in October. NX entered the scene and offered the latest installment of the incredibly popular Dragon Quest series in Japan, with Dragon Quest VII. It was the next killer app for Sony's console and skillfully joined the ranks of other bestsellers from different developers. Additionally, Dragon Quest VII was set to be the first console spin-off to be released outside of Japan, although Europe was overlooked once again. For this, we should receive two high-quality sequels to play with Tension 2 and Dino Crisis 2, which had come to life on the PlayStation 1. Tension 2 offered the same stealth gameplay, which was better balanced compared to its predecessor, while Capcom took a new direction with Dino Crisis 2, developing the game to be significantly more action-oriented, which did not please all fans. In December, the PS made its way across the big pond, while all eyes were rather on the PS and the upcoming release in October. As in Japan, loyal fans gathered hours before the big midnight sale in the USA, standing in long lines outside the stores to be among the first buyers. The release of the third Spyro installment almost took a back seat, but the game was once again top-notch and offered excellent platforming gameplay. However, Insomniac Games distanced themselves from the Little Dragon, just as Naughty Dog had done before them. Shortly thereafter, work on Ratchet & Clank was set to begin, and Insomniac was to be developed into another first-party studio. In November, Sony celebrated the release of the PlayStation in Europe. However, a few notable sequels to well-known PS games were also released. This is how John Tanner started his next mission in Driver 2. This time, he could even get out of the vehicles and explore the metropolises on foot. Getting into other vehicles was also possible in the sequel, allowing for more gameplay options. Vivendi offered Crash Bash, a party game inspired by Mario Party. It was the first Crash Bandicoot spin-off developed not by Naughty Dog but by Eurocom, and it failed to generate much buzz. The same happened to Tomb Raider, The Last Revelation, the fifth and final adventure of Lara Croft, which was set to be released for PlayStation. The reviews were mixed, and all hopes were pinned on the upcoming PS successor, Tomb Angel of Darkness. The two role-playing games from Namco and Squaresoft fared much better. Tales of Eternia was the second Tales of game developed for the PlayStation and looked significantly better than the Tales of Destiny, which reminded players of the old bit days. And Final Fantasy IX was, of course, the quintessential PS release during the pre-Christmas season, although the game once again did not reach the sales figures of the seventh installment. Major new announcements for the PlayStation became scarce starting in 2001. Of course, there were still some interesting releases on the horizon, but the majority of games were now being played on the PlayStation 2, which became available worldwide in early 2001 and had to first establish itself against the Xbox and the GameCube, both of which also launched in 2001 and were ready to make their mark. The video game industry was finally set to fully embrace the next generation, which of course came at the expense of the older consoles. In 2001, Fear Effect 2 was the only notable title released in spring. In March, it became clear how the release of the PlayStation 2 had affected the sales figures of the PlayStation. In the fiscal year 2000, Sony was only able to sell 9.31 million consoles, while during the same period 9.2 million PlayStation 2 systems were sold. That was almost 50% less compared to the same period last year. However, Sony had no intention of discontinuing the PlayStation. In May, there was even a multi-platform release. Alone in the Dark, the new Nightmare was released for both PlayStation and PlayStation 2, and for the sake of completeness, I would also like to mention the Dreamcast release. And Konami released 2 games in one with Castlevania Chronicles, although that's not entirely accurate. Essentially, it was a collection that included the NES remake of the first part, which had been released on the SharpX home computer in Japan at the time, as well as an enhanced and modernized version of the remake on a disc. And then E3 gathered all the experts together. The event was once again focused on the new consoles, which Sony emphasized with trailers for Devil May Cry, Jak and Daxter, Klonoa 2, Silent Hill 2, and Metal Gear Solid 2. There was no material on new and upcoming PS highlights, which indicated that the PlayStation was slowly but surely on the decline. Of course, there were still plenty of new releases, but the real top titles took their time until November. With Mega Man X and Siphon Filter 3, these were again pure sequels of well-known game series that carried the PlayStation through the Christmas season. Starting in 2002, the beginning of the end for the PlayStation was evident. Heavy hitters became even rarer, and the console understandably lost almost all momentum. Interesting PS games were backward compatible on the PlayStation 2. New PlayStation systems were mostly purchased by people who could not afford the expensive PlayStation 2. In March, this became evident when Sony presented the latest sales figures. In the fiscal year 2001, only 7.4 million PlayStation consoles were sold, with a continuing downward trend. Sony slowly but surely laid the PlayStation to rest, as important games were hardly released anymore. In September, Klonoa Beach Volleyball from Namco was launched. The fun sports game was entertaining, but it didn't really impress anyone. The same happened with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, which was once again a multi-platform release. Activision was happy to take the sellers with them, but most played the game on the new consoles. In 2003, only 4 games were released for the console: Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22, Evil, Hail to the King, Wings of Adventure, and MLB 2000. In terms of sales figures, the PlayStation stood at 6.78 million and was expected to fall to 2.77 million by 2005 before Sony discontinued it in March. In 2006, it finally pulled the plug and ceased production of the console after 11.5 years. While it was not very surprising, I was still a bit shocked that the console was offered and produced for so long. In the early and mid-2000s, I didn't hear much about the PlayStation anymore, also because the PlayStation 2 had such a strong presence. But the PlayStation did not leave the stage in 2006 without one last game. Capcom released Strider Hyde in September 2006, marking the final PlayStation game in Japan, which brought the total number of released games worldwide to over 1,278 titles were released in the USA, 1,644 in Europe. One must be a bit cautious with the numbers here and differentiate. Often, multiple versions of a game were offered, for example, in cases where games were translated into different languages. The 1644 games do not represent 1644 individual titles. However, the number is still sensational and simply incredible for a newcomer in the video game sector. Overall, the PS had over 120 million sellers. I have brought you the top 10 best-selling PlayStation games. Thus, Gran Turismo ranks first with 10.85 million units sold, followed by Final Fantasy VII with 10.02 million. In third place, Gran Turismo 2 with 9.37 million. Next up is Final Fantasy VIII, Tekken 3, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which totally shocked me. Crash Bandicoot 2 secures 7th place, followed by Crash Bandicoot 3 with 7.13 million copies sold. The last places are taken by Tomb Raider and Metal Gear Solid, although I would have thought that Metal Gear would be much higher up. These and other hits have ensured that the PlayStation was sold a total of 102.49 million times. With this, Sony outperformed Nintendo and Sega by a wide margin with their first system, at least in the home console market. No console was more successful, and no system paved the way for the entire video game industry into the heart of society as firmly as Sony's first platform. With the help of the PlayStation, video games were no longer just toys, but were played and appreciated by an increasing number of adults. In summary, it can be said that Sony did everything right with the PlayStation, which was fundamentally thanks to individuals. Starting with Ken Kutaragi, who saw the potential in the video game industry, and also Norio Oga, who went against the opinions of his managers and gave Kutaragi the green light. However, an Ian Hetherington from Psygnosis should also be mentioned here, as he ensured that the PlayStation became attractive to game developers with its PC-based development kits. And of course, the success of the PlayStation was due to the countless amazing games that were created not only by Sony itself, but also by other third-party studios. There were simply many right decisions made in a chaotic environment. It's no wonder that the PlayStation is still considered one of the best consoles of all time and is loved by millions of fans. The toy business, which was mocked by the Sony executives, now accounts for the majority of revenue and is considered Sony's most successful division. And Nintendo, well, they simply created their strongest competitor themselves. Here, arrogance was punished in a very unique way. The PlayStation has not been produced for 18 years. However, that does not stop many fans from continuing to have fun with the countless PS games. Starting with the PS, which could play PlayStation games natively, Sony also built backward compatibility into the PS, allowing the games to be displayed on modern televisions. Since the PS, that is unfortunately no longer possible, but you can still download countless games from the PlayStation Store today. In 2018, the PS Classic was released, a mini version of the first PlayStation that included 20 classics. However, Sony did not exactly cover itself in glory with the PS Classic. The built-in emulator left much to be desired, which is why the homebrew scene took it upon themselves to improve the performance. Anyone who is skilled in emulation can still have fun with PlayStation games across platforms to this day. It doesn't matter whether it's on Android devices, PC, or modded consoles. Even original consoles can be used effortlessly today and offer new and modern ways to enjoy your favorite games. For example, with the X-Station, there is a mod that allows you to launch PS games directly from an SD card, completely replacing the error-prone drive. And with the Memcard Pro and the Defender from Retrofighters, we have modern alternatives available that prioritize the fun of gaming. Those who wish can even opt for an internal HDMI mod to connect the PlayStation to modern televisions. As for me, I still use the PlayStation on a CRT television, which in my opinion is still the best way to experience the classics. The fact that we still have so many alternatives to choose from in 2024 clearly shows that the console and its games have lost none of their fascination, and that Sony has truly created a timeless device. Many of today's best and most successful video games originated on the PS. For this reason alone, the console deserves the reputation it enjoys to this day. But yes, that should be it. It was important for me in this video not only to shed light on the development and journey of the PlayStation, but also to touch on the most important games, even if only briefly. And I think I have succeeded quite well, even though it resulted in the video being a little too long. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed it. If that is the case, I would appreciate a like, and perhaps you could share the retrospective with other PlayStation fans who are not yet familiar with my channel. So go ahead and hit the keys and tell me about your memories of the good old PlayStation. When did you get it and what were your favorite games? Thank you for watching and see you next time here on Game Worlds. Adios, your Andy.